Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Linda, and I'm originally from Michigan, now living in the St. Louis metro area. I'm a college coach with School Match for You and have a daughter at University of Chicago.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. Good morning, friends. I'm extremely happy to come meet with you today, and I'm almost always happy. I can literally only think of one time when I was not excited about a podcast, and that's when Kobe Bryant just passed 5 minutes before I had to record, and I felt sucker punched in the gut. He went to high school in Lower Merion High School, and I lived pretty close to that. And as I always followed him for the last 20 plus years. But sometimes I'm like kind of an 8 out of 10 on the clouds, or maybe an 8.5 or even a 9. But this time I'm like 10 out of 10. I'm like chomping at the bits. 3 or 4 days ago, I'm like, I can't wait to record. And so what's going on? Well, 3 reasons why I'm super pumped. One is I had an amazing week. Second, I have an exciting announcement. And then thirdly, I just think this episode is a special one. I think our question from a listener segment is really going to be helpful. And the new interview we have, I just think you're going to help a lot of people to get a better understanding of admissions. But let me start out talking a little bit about my week. Before I do, I want to share something I've never shared on the podcast before. So if you were to go to a cemetery in Dallas, Texas, you would actually see a tombstone for Elijah Stucker. And that was actually our son, who was born stillbirth at 38 weeks on March 1st, 1995. And God has just blessed us with 2 amazing daughters that are such a blessing that I really have never really pined to have a son the rest of my life. I've just really felt so fulfilled. But the closest I've really come to experiencing a son is with my nephew, my brother's son, Alex, Norm's son. And now that he's 23, he came for the first time on his own. And the last 4 days, we've just been hanging out, watching football, going to restaurants, hanging out in the hot tub like 2.5 hours, just having a blast. Well, he left on Saturday, and I had an amazing time with him. But you know what? I was missing college counseling. So Saturday, I was in the counseling room with multiple sessions, and I just totally had a blast. And it was just awesome. So yeah, I had an awesome week. But I also have an exciting update for you. And that is our first Your College Bound Kid gathering is going to be Saturday, just March 23rd at 7 p.m., Kelby Farms apartment in the clubhouse of Durham, North Carolina. And we're going to have 30 minutes of mingling and light refreshments, 30 minutes of podcast trivia and college trivia. And we're even going to have some small prize giveaways. And for those who want to leave right after an hour, fine. You can bolt, no problem. Informal. Pop in when you want. We'll kind of end the program. But we are going to stay around another 30 minutes for those of you who just want to chat and do some more mingle. So mingle, trivia, prize giveaway, food, more mingling, call it a day. Well, what's the news? You're like, Stuck, you already told us this. The news is our sign-up form is up. It's actually been up for 4 or 5 days. It went up on the 18th of January. And all you do is go to yourcollegeboundkid.com. We've added an events page. We used to have that before, but we took it away. So we've got that events page back. Just click the YCBK Gathering Durham tab and complete the short sign-up form. And I'll tell you, friends, my heart was really warmed because one of our listeners was on the website and saw the form and went ahead and signed up. when you sign up, you put your zip code in, and I didn't recognize that zip code, so I put it in, and I'm like, wow, they're coming from over 2 hours away from another state. We just have amazing listeners, and we just can't wait to meet you. So please sign up. And once again, you sign up by going to yourcollegeboundkid.com, go to the events page, and just click YCBK Gathering Durham and complete the sign up form. And here's some more awesome news, friends. Susan values you guys so much as a listener that she's coming all the way from Eastern Pennsylvania just to attend this event. That's right. She attended SACAC last year. In fact, we all met there, but she wasn't planning on coming to SACAC this year. But when we had this event, she's like, I need to come meet our listeners. So Susan's coming, that's a pretty far hike, from the greater Philly area to Durham. So you'll definitely get to meet Susan, and Lisa, Linda, and myself will all be there. All right, let's get to today's content. So Michelle Silbernagel, she's a college counselor in the Pacific Northwest, and she sent in a great question about whether colleges are surreptitiously using imputed test scores. So even if you do not want them to be factoring your test scores in, are they doing that? There's a lot of buzz out there about that. And Julie and I addressed that question straight on in our question for a listener segment. Next, we have one of my favorite interviews I've done. And I know you guys hear me say that a lot. And it's true, I have said that probably more than 10 times. But it's really good, and I think you're going to find it to be real helpful. So with Andy Strickler, he's the Dean of Admissions at Connecticut College, and it's a 3-parter. And then later, in about 6 weeks or so, Andy's going to come back and do a spotlight on Connecticut College as well. But I've done over 150 interviews, and I've been thinking a lot lately, friends, on what makes a great interview. And I've come to the conclusion that the best interviewees are the ones where the thought leader is transparent. And I've had some interviews where the interviewee was just so guarded, I just couldn't get anything out of them. I'm not going to name names, but I remember one I had with a major national thought leader in the profession. And I felt like a dentist trying to pull a tooth from a patient who was bucking me every step of the way. It was like the person was just afraid to go on a public forum and have some candor. But when I think of my favorite interviews that I've done, and I'm sure I'm missing a half dozen, but some of the ones that just pop into my mind are like Christina Lopez from Barnard, and Chris Gruber from Davidson, Heath Einstein from Texas Christian University, Courtney Minden from Babson, Hillary Dickman from Colorado College. She talked about the process she's using to help her own daughter identify how many spots are available at selective schools. Akil Bello on test scores, and recently Lee Coffin of Dartmouth. Those are just a few where the thought leader let you, the listener, into the sausage making process to really help you understand how decisions are made. Those are my favorite ones. And quite honestly, moving forward, I'm really looking for people that have shown me through other conversations I've seen them have, or even in my own dealings with them, that they're going to drop the guard. Guess what? Andy Strickler does just that. I really enjoyed meeting Andy in Houston at NACAC. Susan and Julia have spoken really highly of him. I thought he'd really be the perfect person to address a topic that I've wanted someone to address for some time. And he addresses that topic. And that topic is, how is admissions file reading different when a competitive school sends a boatload of applications to a college? And I asked Andy that question, and in my opinion, he hit the ball out of the park. So today you're going to hear part 1 of 3 on that topic. So without any further ado, let's dive right into our content. All right, Julia. The other day you were talking about, look out for me, I'm going to be spicy. You might have to look out for me because I think I'm going to get spicy on this one.
I think other people will join you on this.
Oh, boy. So I'm so thankful to Michelle Silbernagel for sending this question in. Michelle's a college counselor on the West Coast, and this is a great question. And it's a rumor spreading around. I'm just going to play it, and then we can have some conversation.
Hi, Mark. This is Michelle Silbernagel from Seattle, Washington. And I just listened to episode 382, where you did this wonderful roundup of the test optional and how people can trust or not trust what a college is saying. It was really great. One thing that I didn't hear you address, and I apologize if I missed it, but I wonder if you could speak to the topic of imputed scores. I recently attended a webinar done by Compass Education, and Adam Ingersoll gave a presentation, and he talked about how some colleges are actually imputing test scores from students' transcripts and from what they know about a particular high school, and that some of the evidence indicates that imputed scores could be less than 25, the 25th percentile. And so what I'm saying here is that I've heard that colleges will, if a student is not submitting an actual test, they will impute the score based on what they know from that particular high school and that student's grades. So someone in the actual webinar asked a question, and I think I heard they said that they thought that an imputed score might actually be 100 points below what the student would actually have submitted. So that leads me to think that in some cases, students might very well want to consider submitting their test scores. And I'm wondering if you have heard anything about this, if it's just a certain type of school. I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this, and if you're going to start asking admissions representatives their policy on score imputation. I'm really looking forward to your answer. Thanks so much. I appreciate everything you do for us.
All right, Julia. So before we dive into this one, you remember when I reached out to you on this one? And I was like, Julia, what does your gut say about this? So I reached out to Julia and I said, why don't we talk to some admission officers? Like Michelle asked us if we could, actually, in the question. What are you hearing from the admission professional community? I felt like this question warranted some conversations with admissions professionals, because after Michelle brought it in, then I started hearing there's something called the IECA Professional Conference, and it's supposed to be more advanced people in the profession. And I heard this is like percolating out there in the rumor mill. So I said to Julia, what do you think before we get feedback? And we both were like, that does not sound right to me. Remember that? We were texting?
Yes.
This does not sound right. First of all, think of the ethical conflict of you're telling everybody your test optional, and then meanwhile you're extracting some imputed scores. There's major integrity issues with that. And then think of the legal ramifications,
Right.
potentially, if you're saying something. And then I had one thought, and then after I say this, I'm going to let Julia share her thoughts, and I'm going to let Julia share. She literally went and shared this question with some admissions professionals that we both know that really know their game, and I'll let her share with you the feedback. But my first thought, we had Akil Bello on our podcast not too long ago, and I was listening to Akil Bello and Ed Pickett from Pomona and Williams College admission officer. And they're having a conversation about, something very similar to what we've talked on this podcast. Is test optional really test optional? Just schools mean what they say. Akil Bello said something 3 times in that podcast. He said, be very, very leery and wary of test prep companies telling you that schools are really not test optional because they financially benefit from people signing up for test prep. And he said it 3 times. He said at the start he said at the middle, and it was his close. And that was my initial thought. Compass is a test prep company that makes money by people signing up for test prep. So I was cynical from the beginning, and it would be such a scandal, especially the going and extracting scores. Now, if a test score is on a transcript, it kind of is it's hard to not see a number when you see it. That to me is different.
Yes.
Susan has correctly pointed out that the training you receive as an admissions reader or admissions officer lets you know how to handle test scores in your academic rating, that the schools have a mechanism for taking the score that you inadvertently see and you want it to be a test optional applicant so it won't inversely impact your academic rating. It's a whole different discussion whether if an admission officer sees a test score that is way out of profile and they assign it the right academic rating by the rubric, whether or not it impacts whether they'll advocate for a student in a committee process. And I think there's different people on our team would have different perspectives on that. But the proactive going in and trying to extract scores, look, I will never say never. I mean, Temple Online Business got busted with what they were doing at faking rankings. We can never say never, but there's no way to me this was widespread with reputable schools. Anyway, your thoughts, Julia, and why don't you share what we heard back as you did some research?
Yeah, so when you told me this, Mark, I had a little conniption. I was so worried and it made me really, really scared because I would like to think that there's no credibility to this, but it sometimes can feel like the wild, wild west out there.
Sure.
So,
Fair.
and I'm just waiting for a parent to ask me this question now.
You're right.
So I did go poll. I have 2 pieces of feedback from both our deans of admission and VPs of the college at both of them. One college admits less than 14% of its applicants. The other college admits around 60% of their applicants. So both selective, but in very different ways. And when I asked them the initial question, I said, is there any credibility to this? And they were both so upset. They were like, no, absolutely none. So I even said, after they gave me some feedback, I said, oh, thank you so much. Like Mark and I are just going to, try to talk about this on the podcast. And they're like, you can use our names because this is so absurd. And it's really scary that they did want to be credited. So Mike Keaton, VP of Enrollment over at Ursinus College, when I had asked, his answer was, no, I don't think there's any credibility to this. Absolutely none. Why would a college even do that? It doesn't benefit the college in any way. He went on to say, I wouldn't have time to do that. I wouldn't know how to do that. I don't see why I would do that. And it would make my reading harder. It would take reading longer. And for what reasons? There might be a college doing it, but I can't imagine it's a widespread thing. It's not that hard to make decisions test optional. And I would imagine the more selective a place is, the easier it is to make those decisions. But I can only speak to my experience. And then Just Lord, Dean and VP at Haverford, said he completely agrees with Mike. I've never heard of a school doing this, and it would be counter to our self-interest anyways. I can't imagine why anyone would do this for student-centered or non-student-centered reasons.
Yeah, and these guys have both been around for a while. They've been at multiple different schools in high-level positions. They're well-connected, well-networked. And so, yeah, they have their own experience. And I just don't believe, I think Mike summarized it well. He said something like, there may be some school doing it, but it's hard to believe it's widespread.
Right.
I just think that, imagine the potential lawsuits. And think, and it's also pretty risky because we've talked about this before, but admission officers are underpaid, underappreciated, and have a high stress, high demand job. So there's a lot of turnover.
Right.
So how easy would it be for one disgruntled admission officer to call up the New York Times? I just think even for self-preservation reasons, nobody would ever do that. That is exactly what Just Lord said in the quote Julia read to you. What did Just say? Let me repeat it. What Just said was, I can't imagine why anyone would do this. Now check this out. For student-centered or non-student-centered reasons. That's great. That's gold. But I also think that most schools have too much integrity and they wouldn't do it for integrity reasons too.
Agreed. I would hope so. Yes.
Yeah, no, most schools. I really think that most schools are not just out saying constantly saying we're test optional, and then they're doing. But in my mind, I do differentiate between, I just happened to look at the transcript and I saw the 990. that was on there, and now I can't get it out of my mind. To me, that is not the same thing.
Agreed.
Because you didn't go looking for it. So that is something that listeners you may want to be aware of. Is your school putting test scores on the transcript? And if it is, and those are not good, to what degree is that number emblazoned in somebody's mind? And so you say test optional, and they're like, it was a 9-10, you know?
Yes, and actually, you do really want to pay attention because some colleges would consider that self-reporting, and so they think you are actually wanting to include your test score. So, definitely something to check out on your school transcript. Make sure that there's not test scores on there.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for reaching out to two of the giants in the profession, Mike and
Yes,
Jess.
yeah. I'm very much hopeful that I don't want anyone to be in a panic about this. And I think it makes all the sense, right? Like if you're going to impute a score and it's imperfect and it's likely lower than what the score is, how would that a college only wants to report high test scores, so it wouldn't serve them either. So if we think about the logic, I feel a lot more. My blood pressure was much more lowered after that.
Yeah, and at some point, probably sooner with Mike than Jess, they both have given verbals to come on this podcast. Julie and I are going to have a podcast interview coming up, hopefully with both of them. Certainly Mike's, we're talking dates already for that. So you'll look forward to that. And we'll talk to them about their schools as well as some other issues in the profession. But strongly look forward to that. They're two really, really fine men. But thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
And Michelle, let us know if you want Elliot Felix's book, How to Get the Most Out of College, 127 Ways to Make Connections, Make It Work for You, and Make a Difference, or Dr. Lewis Newman's book, Thinking Critically in College, The Essential Handbook for Student Success. Now, Michelle's a member of our college counselor confab group, so she already has my cell phone, so I can spare you sharing my cell one more time.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Andy tells us about the 5 different schools he has worked at and the roles he has had at those schools. Andy talks about the ways reading one school group together as its own entity really allows the reader to learn so many different things and to make more accurate admissions decisions. And Andy answers the question, is it harder to get admitted if you are applying from a busy school group that is full of high-achieving kids, or a school with an average amount of students that apply to your school, or one that has students that rarely apply to your school? Listen and enjoy. Friends, you're in for a real treat today. I'm here with Andy Strickler, the Director of Admission at Connecticut College. Welcome to your College-Bound Kid podcast, Andy.
Thanks, Mark. How are you today?
Good. Andy reminded me, we actually go back to his days at Kalamazoo College when he was a rep then. He's like, you sound very familiar. Were you the guy who spearheaded the college fair at Westtown? So good memory. So why don't you walk us through your background and tell us, different places, stints you've had in admissions, different roles you have. Love to know the context from which you're going to speak today.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up outside Philly, as you can tell, because I got my Philadelphia Phillies thing in the background. And my dog, named after Philly legend Chase Utley, is actually sitting 12 feet over there. I lucked into a wonderful, diverse Quaker liberal arts college in the Midwest, where I ran cross country and track. I thought I was actually going to go be a high school coach and teacher. And as I was looking for jobs, an opportunity to be a college coach came up, and I stumbled into becoming the head cross country coach at Kalamazoo College in Michigan, which then was a part-time job, which then morphed into a part-time cross country job and full-time admissions job. So I spent 10 years at Kalamazoo, 1 year at Beloit, 3 years at Ursinus College outside Philadelphia, 4 years at Guilford, first as the director, then as the Dean of Admission and Financial Aid, and I am currently in my 9th year at Connecticut College as the Dean of Admission and Financial Aid. So as I like to tell folks, every student running around this campus at this point in time is my fault. So, when they get in disciplinary problems or, they hit a game-winning shot, it's all my fault at this point. So that's been my path. I've actually coached at, now 3 different spots. So there's a nice sort of athletic sort of mix to what I get to do, which is great. And I've worked at just a handful of amazing, wonderful small liberal arts colleges across the Midwest, the South, and here in New England.
Well, we love having guests on that have been at multiple schools. And if I was counting correctly, I think was that six? Was that six? I think I counted
there's
six.
Earlham, Kalamazoo, Beloit, Ursinus, Guilford, and then Conn. So if you include my alma mater, it's 6, professionally 5.
There you go. And like you said, South, Midwest, New England, everything, pretty good range of experiences that lets you see a lot of models, a lot of different perspectives. And I do have to say, we have 7 co-hosts on the College Bound Kid podcast. 2 of them wish they could have been here today. They said to give you greetings. Susan Tree, of course, you guys go back. I know when you were at Guilford, I know you guys worked really closely together.
Yep.
And then Julia Esquivel at Milton Academy is also one of our co-hosts today.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And they both wanted me to say hi to you. So I want to get that in there.
That's great. That's great. Too bad they couldn't make it today.
Yeah. So, friends, we have a really exciting topic today. Andy, you also are, I guess, the main point person for some schools. So you keep in the loop as the primary contact. And when you look at who Andy works with, he works with several of the Manhattan independent schools. And he also works with Phillips Exeter, St. Paul's, and Choate. Now, these are some of the highest achieving schools in the country. These are college preparatory schools that send large numbers of applicants. And it's a question that we often get from listeners, what's it like if I'm going to be in a competitive pool and there's 50, 60, classmates of mine applying? I mean, we have listeners from Brooklyn Tech, Bronx Science, Stuyvesant, yeah. Where they're sending crazy numbers of places. And so I wanted to just throw it out to you, open-end it. You've been doing this a while. You've had territories, I'm sure, where, hey, we got 1 kid every 5 years from you,
Right.
Compared to, are you comfortable sharing around how many applicants you would get from some of those feeders?
Yeah, sure. Early in, and we can go all the way back to my days at Kalamazoo.
Sure.
Where I would recruit, towards the tail end of my tenure there, I recruited Oakland County, which is suburban Detroit. And we had a fabulous relationship with Cranbrook Kingswood.
Sure.
And we would regularly get 12 to 14 to 15 apps per year from Cranbrook Kingswood. We'd get 12 to 14 to 16 apps a year from Grosse Pointe South. Here at Conn, the one that I'm thinking about is Choate Rosemary Hall, which is 65 minutes away from Conn, draws students from a number of different geographies. There's a nice relationship that exists, and we'll get anywhere on a low year, it'll be 8 or 9 apps. Some years we'll get 12 to 14 apps, depending on the year from Choate. And then, Exeter and St. Paul's will get 6 to 8 to 10 apps a year, depending on the year and the cohort of students and, those particular students' desires, needs, aspirations, profile, and in some respects, how they're advised to help craft the kind of college list which is going to allow them to achieve success in the process.
Sure.
So I've seen it in a number of different places.
So this open-endedly, what's the difference or any of the differences when you're reading from what some schools call a busy school group versus, one where maybe you may or may not get a kid every 5 years?
Yeah. So first, I think the first thing that's important to mention, and we do this at Conn, and I've really tried to do this at most every stop, is we typically will read a school group in one sitting.
Yep.
So if I'm sitting down, I'm at Kalamazoo, and I sit down to read Cranbrook, I'm trying to read all the Cranbrook apps at the same time, because what I'm trying to do there, whether it's reading Choate or reading Cranbrook, is to have, in some respects, a recency bias, but fresh in your mind, the school that you're reading, the curriculum that is offered, what the students have opted to take, performance variances that exist, but it allows you to create a baseline of comparative data in a recency bias sort of way, that you're reading them all at one sitting, which gives you the chance to not necessarily over familiarize, but deeply familiarize yourself with the curriculum, the options that are available, what students have taken, and then the performance sort of spectrum that we're talking about when it comes to grades. And different institutions have sort of different institutional objectives when they're trying to read a large school group. You know, at Kalamazoo, we're trying to maximize admits and enroll students. Here at Con, it's a little different because we're a little bit more selective. And I think the further up the food chain an institution would get, they're applying different lenses to a large school group like that. And there are so many different factors that are going to play into how a school group can be analyzed and how admission decisions are going to be reached as a result of that. Whether that's, you know, there's been a lot of conversation about legacy, whether there's a legacy in the pool or not. There's a lot of conversation in the admission landscape about athletics and whether student A, B, or C is a recruited student athlete. So each institution is going to have their own sort of institutional priorities and institutional realities that they're going to bring to analysis of a school group. And those are going to influence how things are read, how things are presented in committee, and then the eventual admission decisions that a student gets.
No, that's all great. Can you talk about some of the ways in which you feel the recency effect, let's call it, coupled with the glut of apps, allows you academically to understand better how a student is doing in context?
Yeah, I mean, I reflect back on my upbringing in admission at Kalamazoo. And at Kalamazoo, I read Grosse Pointe, then I read Oakland County. And at the time, Cranbrook Kingswood would limit the number of AP students that an individual kid could take, number of AP classes, excuse me. And for Cranbrook, a student was allowed to max out at 4 AP classes. Whereas at, you know, University Liggett or Grosse Pointe South or Grosse Pointe North, there were no curricular limitations. So when a reader is reading, it's really important not to bounce back and forth between, say, Grosse Pointe South and Cranbrook Kingswood, because at Grosse Pointe South at Kalamazoo, we were expecting 8 to 10 to 11 AP classes just to satisfy what we would consider to be a moderately to decently rigorous curriculum. Whereas at Cranbrook, if a student had 2 or 3 AP classes, we're like, wow, that's really rigorous because they limit students to 4. 1 in the junior year and 3 in the senior year. That's how it was back, and this is a million years ago.
Sure.
I don't know if that's the way it still is. But that's part of the key about recency bias, is not bouncing back and forth between curricular options A and curricular limitations A and curricular options B and curricular limitations B. So it allows you to immerse yourself in that school community for a day to a day and a half, as long as it takes to read all those apps, to ensure that you're providing a level of consistency when it comes to reading and evaluating specifically the academic side of the apps, and then allowing to be able to put the personal side in some pretty solid context.
So let me just bounce a couple potential reading benefits that come to mind to me.
Sure.
And tell me if you would agree,
Yep.
with these. So one would be, let's say a student has a particularly low grade that's concerning in an important class, but now you have a bunch of students maybe with that same class and that same teacher, and let's just throw a grade out. Let's say it's an 82, which is, not the highest grade for, it's not an F, but it's not the highest grade for a place like Con College, right? But let's say you, all of a sudden in the school group, you're realizing, look, a lot of the top kids here seem like they're getting mid 80 grades. Maybe this teacher grades hard. Are those the kinds of things that you're able to extract when you are able to do the comparative data?
100%. 100%. And sometimes a counselor letter will add some context to a particular student's record. But having multiple transcripts and students who have taken that class gives you hard data, not anecdotal information from the counselor, but hard data in terms of gifted students who have a certain academic profile. And this one particular class may present some quote unquote academic hiccups where this teacher's just really a hard grader. Absolutely, 100%.
And wouldn't you say the opposite's also true? Like, wow, the 97 looked good, but everybody's getting 95s or higher here. That's part of our contextual read there as well.
Exactly. Absolutely, 100%. You know, and some high schools have moved away from taking information off of their school profile regarding grade distribution charts. A large school group gives us the ability to do that in some cases with particular classes.
Sure. And another thing that comes to mind is just the overall rigor too. The rigor, assuming there's not caps on APs. When you line everybody up, you can really look and say, wow, this person really did go further than somebody else, which is more knowledge than just having profile data, because it's actually school specific.
Exactly. Absolutely. You can go transcript by transcript by transcript by transcript, reading the file, and really get a sense, wow, this student has really sought out a super rigorous curriculum. And maybe that puts a slightly moderated performance into greater context, or maybe it actually puts high performance into real sort of a gleaning light in terms of, wow, this is amazing.
Let's talk about another one, recommendation. So let's say you happen to have the same rec writer. Let's just say it's an English AP teacher and multiple people have chosen the same rec writer.
Yes.
Isn't it also easier to see the nuance of the enthusiasm that the teacher has for one student and how they've impacted the classroom when you have the same rec writer multiple times?
It can, but it doesn't always work out that way.
Elaborate on both sides. The can and how it doesn't always.
So what I would say is, and I hate to draw I will not mention the class, but there was one particular teacher at Grosse Pointe South High School who taught an AP class, who was the most, in my opinion, the most sought out recommendation letter in the history of Grosse Pointe South High School. And I learned this because all the letters were incredibly similar. The first paragraph was a rote, copied paragraph about the class. And then there was a second paragraph that detailed some elements of the student. Okay. In that case, I think that teacher was sought out because they were considered to be the hardest teacher at Grosse Pointe South High School. And in some respects, the letters didn't necessarily do a strong service to the students because I thought they were overly generic.
Yeah.
But there are times when you can really, and sometimes it's very deliberate and very clear. And other times it's way more nuanced, but you can absolutely pick up on the cues of the students who have really elevated the learning environment for themselves and for everybody, and the students who have really enriched the school community for X, Y, or Z. There are tons of circumstances where that is the case.
And I'm sure the counselor letter could be another place if you're getting writing there too, because a lot of times that's the same person.
Yep.
So it's easy to do comparison stuff there.
Exactly. Yep.
I wish Susan could have been here, and she tried really hard to make it because I wanted to share with you a conversation that the two of us were having, and I'd love for her to speak in her own words, but I'd love to get your thoughts on this. So, we were just having a conversation, and a lot of times when it comes to some of these really brand name, high-powered schools, a lot of the ones that are in your reading, there can be a perception from families that going to these schools makes it a lot easier to get into selective universities because they look at college lists and they say, oh, it's kind of impressive. Now, on the other hand, there's a lot of things the family doesn't know. One, how selective the school was to get into in the first place. So it's not a reflection of the population at large.
Right.
Secondly, a lot of times these really selective schools, they admit kids with the colleges in mind. So things like athletic hooks and things like that play a role in who actually gets in.
Yep.
So Susan and I were having the conversation that we think in a lot of ways it's actually harder from a really competitive school with lots of people in the applicant pool getting into an elite school. What are your thoughts on that? And I know there's a lot of nuance there.
Yeah, so the argument would be like a student from Choate who's applying to Brown. And then they're going to have a school group of 18 to 20 to 25 students who've applied to Brown, that it's more difficult.
And I'll tell you, it's like more than 50 because I've actually seen their Naviance data.
Okay, yeah. So
Yeah.
I think that working theory is at least pretty legit. I do.
Yeah. And by the way, Julia can say that too, because she's got places where they send more than 50 kids too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Explain that, because I think our listeners may not understand all that's involved in that. Flesh that out for us.
I would say sometimes volume can work against you. If you're, and let's think about, let's throw a school out there from New England, you know, or a school that would not have an extraordinarily large applicant pool from New England. Now I'm thinking about a place like Rice.
Sure.
Highly selective, wonderful place, right? It might get 1 or 2 or 3 apps a year from a place like Milton or Choate or something like that, versus Brown that's going to have 25 or 30. And most of the elite superstars at a place like Choate are going to apply to, you know, be likely to apply to a place like Brown, right?
Yep.
If you are that single data point, the 1 or 2 apps from Choate applying to Rice, first of all, I think it's fairly certain for a place like Rice to say, this student's done their research. We are a little bit off the beaten path. And therefore, this student probably innately has a higher level of interest in our institution because they're from a little bit off the beaten path. And the other piece of this on the other side is, if you're thinking about a highly selective place like Brown, or, you know, think about a school group that we would have with 8 to 10 to 12 apps. How do we figure out, 1, the students who are really going to thrive here, 2, the students who are really going to contribute here, and 3rd, who are the students who are really interested in here? And we travel with a group of schools called 8 of the Best, and in the 8 of the Best group, I'm pretty much known as the guy who cares, or the person who cares most about demonstrated interest. But I think everyone on some level cares about demonstrated interest. And you know, how does a place like Brown or Yale or something like that, or a place like that, figure out who is really actually interested in us in a school group of 25 or 30 to 35 or 40? And with a very small, if you think about the most precious commodity that a place like Yale or Harvard or Princeton or Brown has, it's an offer of admission. And how do we allocate this very finite resource? And how do we prevent ourselves from over allocating an outsized share of admits to one particular school or one particular geographic region? And therefore, I think on both sides, coming from an extraordinarily large school group can potentially work against you.
Friends, this concludes the first part of my interview with Andy Strickler, where we're looking at how decisions are made when a lot of kids apply from the same high school. Hope you'll join us next week for part 2 of 3. Friends, on Thursday's episode, Susan and I start a 2-part series where we look at 3 different articles that look at how application numbers are changing at colleges, especially for early applications, early action, and early decision. But we really get into that discussion in part 2. We never really get past our admissions tip, admissions vernacular, and big number in part 1. So in part 1, we'll be focusing on how colleges read admission files. Our question from a listener comes from Amy, and she wants to know, if a student is standard strong and Pell eligible, what type of colleges should she be applying to in order to get free money? Our interview is the final part of Dan and Mary LaChance discussing Rochester Institute of Technology, and that's also our college spotlight. Friends, remember, hard work beats talent when talent refuses to work hard. See you on Thursday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.